there are elements, in my view, within Ukraine, there are elements within Europe who think that they need an enemy, and that enemy is Russia. And it cannot be denied now that, in fact, Ukraine is now, in addition to whatever the reasons were for the initial conflict, fighting a proxy war. The 17th day of October 2025, which is a Friday, may very well be in the nature of a Good Friday. But our optimism must be guarded, because on this day, President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine will be meeting in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. And this meeting comes at a very interesting time, interesting at several levels. One, that a day before, President Trump has spoken to President Vladimir Putin and have agreed that they will meet in Budapest in Hungary. Second level, it comes at a time when, for the first time, the Ukrainian population is bearing the brunt of the war, particularly with the attack on infrastructure, which has affected power distribution. So the pain is beginning to sink. The third thing, it comes at a time when the President of the United States of America is riding on the crest of the tenuous peace regarding Gaza between Israel and Hamas. So in that context, the Friday meeting must be seen as one that has several promises. Remember also that during that period, the President of the United States has very loudly wondered why it is not him that won the Nobel Peace Prize and it went to a Venezuelan. And he sees himself as the peacemaker in chief in the world at this particular time. So if one were to be a fly on the wall in Oval Office and imagine what it is that will be under discussion, I want to believe that during the conversation between President Trump and President Putin, the question of how to resolve the conflict must have been discussed. And the perimeters and the terms on the basis of which the conflict ought to be resolved. Of course, we cannot and are not privy to the finer details. And that therefore, when President Trump will be addressing President Zelensky, he will, in my view, tell him, really, we must have peace. And we must have peace quickly. And we must have peace in a manner that convinces Russia that you will not be a threat to them. And that threat means that your intimacy with Western Europe and therefore NATO must be something that will be or should be reduced to the level of neutrality. As to whether President Zelensky will accept those proposals, that is a debate that can be carried out. But I want to believe that he will use the occasion and the conversation with President Trump to say, yes, I hear you out. I'm not going to make any commitments at this time. But I am saying that if indeed there is going to be a resolution of this problem between Ukraine and Russia, these are our terms for settlement, at least to have rapprochement, and number two, to have some kind of ceasefire. And I'm saying that these are the things that the Russians must consider. I'll go back to Ukraine. I'll go back to Europe and report to them and hope that they too will endorse. So these are early days yet, but I think these are early days when there is a lot of what I consider to be diplomatic shadow boxing. But remember that Putin also has interests which are very clearly defined. So that if those interests are not met for the benefit of Russia, then it is not going to be easy for President Trump to midwife a ceasefire. On the other hand, you can see very interesting things that are already emanating from Trump by way of applying pressure on both sides. On the one side, he's saying, and publicly so, you, India, stop buying oil from Russia. You Europeans, you are saying things and your words are tough, but you are buying oil and gas from Russia. On the other hand, he is saying publicly, perhaps sending a message, coded message to Russia, if you don't play ball, we are going to give the Tomahawk missiles, which have the capability of hitting St. Petersburg and Moscow. Therefore, play ball. So it is a carrot and stick situation. But what must be remembered is that Russia is not a banana republic. This is a nuclear power, which if push comes to shove, you do not know how they can behave. So all these things are on the table. And this, I think, is one of the most difficult times for anybody who claims to be an analyst and wants to think about what the results would be. I think even when one is looking at the situation, one must be very cautious in terms of what they predict will be. But one thing stands out regardless, that I think there is appetite for cessation of conflict. Of course, there'll always be warmongers. In the war industry would want the war to continue. There are those within Ukraine who, for purposes of political survival, may think that the prolongation of this war keeps them in office. There are those who are worried about what may happen to them if peace is restored. All these factors are playing. There are very many moving parts. And I want to wait and hear what Friday, the 17th day of October 2025, Zelensky Putin, Zelensky Trump will give birth to, and what Putin Trump will give birth to in Budapest, in Hungary. When one looks about the situation of the conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, and one casts in the image of what Trump imagined when he became the president, and he's on record as saying that, in fact, the conflict that he thought he would resolve quickly was the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And he said the reason why he thought he would do so is because of what he considers to be a very warm relationship between him and President Putin. So there is a sense in which there is a chemistry between President Putin and President Trump. And he thought that he could work on that as the magic wand that he would use for purposes of ensuring that there is a resolution to this conflict. But I think that has not been possible, in my view, because there are elements, in my view, within Ukraine, there are elements within Europe who think that they need an enemy, and that enemy is Russia. And it cannot be denied now that, in fact, Ukraine is now, in addition to whatever the reasons were for the initial conflict, fighting a proxy war. And you listen to President Macron, you listen to Steinmeier of the United Kingdom, you listen to some of the elements within the European Union, such as Ursula von der Leyen. You listen even to the messaging from the Prime Minister of Denmark and Sweden and even Norway and even Finland. you get the feeling that they think that this is the opportunity to hit Russia, which in the minds of some is misguided. So in a nutshell, what one sees is a Europe that has appetite for war with Russia, but does not want a direct confrontation. And in their imagination, if there was this conflict under the NATO pact, they thought that they would recruit President Trump very easily. But remember, Trump is ambivalent. At one time he said, you must pay your bills. Then in addition to saying you must pay your bills, he said, remember, there is a big, beautiful ocean between Europe and America, telling them that when the road meets the rubber, when push comes to shove, I'll leave you on your own. So it is a very interesting situation, because when Trump takes these positions, which are personal, I think when he goes back home, he's reminded, but remember, we have a relationship with Europe through NATO. And because of that, you cannot be seen to have changed position so dramatically that you are making Russia your ally to the detriment of our relationship within NATO. And that is why his messaging is conflictual. At one time, he's saying, we are not going to allow Russia to do this. We are not going to allow Russia to do this. We are not going to allow Russia to achieve this. On the one hand, he says, but we can do business with Russia. So these is hide and jackal kind of situation, so that you think you are saying one thing today and you are saying another thing today, but you can see the limits that President Trump has never wanted to cross. He does not want to cross the Rubicon and burn his boots with Putin. He wants to create an environment where he can still have working relationship with Putin, because Russia is a power that cannot be ignored. And remember, there is also a sense in which Russia is beginning to project herself, doing so in Africa, doing so in Latin America, doing so in Asia, and having a very cozy relationship with India and China. And I think he thinks that that can be checkmated if he retains this cordial relationship with Putin at a personal level. And that is why it is also very easy for him to secure quick meetings, like the Budapest meeting, which will follow the meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky. You know, one of the things that is very interesting when one follows activities throughout the world is that during the week that the Gaza peace talks were going on, it is also almost as if the war in Ukraine and Russia was forgotten. And very quickly, everybody was being summoned to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And I think the reason why the meeting relating to Gaza became very urgent is because the optics were bad. Almost in all continents, there were people who were coming out and condemning the genocide, as is now being referred to, of the Palestinians. It was in Europe, it was in Africa, it was in Australia, it was in Latin America. And I think the optics were bad even for the United States of America. So very quickly, Trump was able to put the Arabs together. And Egypt has emerged now as the quintessential peace broker, replacing Qatar in this regard. And what we saw, therefore, in Sharm el-Sheikh is that he put almost all members of the Arab League. Remember, there was an attempt on the part of Trump to invite Netanyahu in Sharm el-Sheikh. We now know is in the public domain that is President Erdogan of Turkey, who told him, if you invite Netanyahu here, everything will be torpedoed. So what happened, of course, it is, number one, I think it was necessary to ensure that these bad images are not there. Number two, I think the war was becoming a senseless war, because you must remember that after the events on the 7th of October in the year 2023, it is the hostage situation that was also becoming, that became the focal point. But even internally, you could see that there was a groundswell against the administration of Netanyahu. So domestic pressure, international bad image, the manner in which Netanyahu was treated at UNGA in the United Nations, all factors conjoined, and the projection of the United States of America as the underwriter of some of these activities, so that the Israelis are seen to be also doing the bidding of the United States of America. Of course, we now have a 20-point agenda which has short, medium term, and long term, but this must also be seen in the context of history. It must be seen in the context of the 1917 Balfour Declaration. You remember the origin of this was 1917, Arthur Balfour writing a letter to Rothschild that you want to create a Jewish state, which is created in 1948. And then that is the beginning in 1948 of the Nakba, which is the dispersal of the Palestinians. And people were saying, when the Israelis were saying, we are going to occupy Gaza, they were saying this is the second Nakba. And people are beginning to make reference to a number of things. One, let us remember the Oslo Accords. And European countries now came out and said, we are recognizing the state of Palestine. Number two, they were saying, let us go back not only to the Oslo Accords, but also let us remember the Abrahamic Accords. So I think when you look at all those factors conjoined, the question that was playing in the mind of both Trump and Netanyahu, we set out to neutralize Hamas. But it appears what happened is that we gave lifeblood to the Palestinian cause for recognition as a separate state. The jury is still out as to whether this ceasefire will hold. We know, for example, that the captives who are alive have been released. We know that those who are dead, their bodies cannot be found. The Israelis have now come out and say, we are reducing the number of trucks from 600 to 300. The Hamas are saying, but you bombed us. The bodies you are asking for are in the rubbles. We need your assistance. And this toing and froing has seen accusations of violations of the ceasefire. And there are individuals within the coalition administration of the Netanyahu administration who actually want the war to continue. They hold the view that you must defeat Hamas, the thing called Hamas. Because in the last few days, when there was a ceasefire, we have seen Hamas executing people who are seen to have collaborated with the Israelis. We have also seen the emergence of some of the other groups. And we have also seen the resurgence of Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah. And the arrangement that has been proposed that you have Fatah in its reorganized form being the ones who will ultimately be in charge of Gaza is being opposed as it was in the early days. So it is a confusing environment because it's so tenuous. And I don't think that the Israelis want to have some of the things actually implemented. Of course, they have withdrawn to what is known as the yellow line. But the final settlement, would they want to cede territory? And if they want to cede territory, would they want to go to a two-state solution with them losing the East Jerusalem, for example, and the Western Bank? These are issues that are not being addressed. And sometimes I'm worried that in an attempt to appear to have peace, we are getting what I call the instant coffee solutions and microwave solutions. The banana is ripening too quickly and it may rot quickly. So the world really needs to come out and ensure that all these things are nailed down and nailed down very quickly so that we just don't get things which are dramatic without addressing the underlying issues. And that it must not be forgotten that the Houthis in Yemen are also saying we are still at war with Israel. It must not be forgotten that the Iranians were also invited, and the Iranians says we must retain our axis. So the Middle East is still a powder keg. The Middle East is one that defies a narrow and simplistic analysis. It would be naivete at its most absurd if we were to say there is a peace deal, therefore peace has broken out, not with the Middle East. Sometimes when I look at the activities in the world today, sometimes they appear as if they are separate and distinct. Yet upon some clear and sober analysis, one can see some thread that links them. Let us look at the Middle East. Americans say we want to retain our control in the Middle East, and that therefore, in order to ensure that that control is retained, a terrorist organization, as they have named Hamas, must be tamed. Tamed because we still want to ensure that we use the Suez Canal. We want to ensure that we don't have the Iranians obtaining nuclear capability because it would affect us. We don't want an unfriendly administration in Syria. We don't want an unfriendly administration in Lebanon. That is one thing that is happening. And the only country that guarantees us that for us is Israel. Then you also have Russia on the one hand, whom you want to have a relationship with. At least Trump's administration wants to ensure that there is that relationship. Then you have a tenuous relationship with NATO, whom you think are not doing as well as they should from the perspective of the United States of America. Then you have a president who wants to be recognized as this peacemaker. And when you listen to him talk about Joe Biden, remember that President Trump says, if I was the president, the war in Gaza would not have started in the first place. If I was president, the war in Ukraine would not have started in the first place. If I was president, we would have closed our borders. He's on record as saying that the Venezuelans have released their malcontents into the United States of America overland, and he's saying that Venezuela is in fact one of the countries that is supplying drugs to the United States, and that President Maduro is at the head of some crime syndicate which is dealing with all these. And remember, there's always been an appetite for regime change, not only with Maduro, but even with Hugo Chavez, because Hugo Chavez was seen to be pro-Cuba at one time. And this must be seen in the context of controlling the Caribbean and ensuring that you have a buffer. Because in Latin America, you also have an administration in Brazil with Lula, which is not pro-United States of America. So all those factors conjoined tell you that there is a single thread, and they must not be seen independent of the fact that there is a rising power, China, and that the United States of America has said that as we speak now, there is a trade war between China and the United States of America. So you need Venezuela, and perhaps this is stretching it too far, that if I don't get this particular Nobel Prize, give it to somebody in Venezuela, so that we are going to use that as the basis of ensuring that there is regime change. Remember that there is also Guaido, who is in the opposition, now is being ignored, is this lady that is the focus. And the President of the United States is on record, I believe, as at the 16th or 15th day of October 2025, as saying, have now ordered the CIA to conduct covert activities inside Venezuela. Rarely does the President of the United States of America say that their intelligence agency is active in a country, but in a very Trumpist way, he has said it. So when you look at all these threads and you look at the fact that there is a military industry and that there is also a business aspect which may be hidden to the uninitiated, then you can see the linkage. Those who want activity in order to control the oil in Venezuela, in order to control the administration in Venezuela so that you have a military presence and a friendly government to checkmate the Lula government, which is seen to be socialist and almost part of the BRICS. We must not forget the BRICS. That in that part of the world, the biggest economy in that sphere is Brazil. And you must not forget that Brazil has now become the supplier of certain products which China was buying from the United States of America. So if you are present, boots on ground in Venezuela, and you are projecting yourself in the Caribbean, you are making something that is useful to the United States of America in that regard. The military industry must also not be forgotten. They need to sell bullets. They need to sell missiles. So the world is very interesting. And when I look at this and I think of the recent display of some of the most sophisticated weapons in China, and I saw the recent parading of what the North Koreans saying is a missile that can hit anywhere in the United States of America, and I see all these apparently innocent activities by the Nobel Peace Committee sitting in Sweden and giving the prize in Oslo, which is where the Peace Prize originated from, then you see that a lot of things, a lot of parts are in motion, but yet there could be a single thread that is connecting them. And the single common denominator in all these things is the United States of America and, of course, President Trump. And if you look at it from that perspective, you can also emerge with one theory. America, which has until now been the dominant economic, military power after the World War II, is feeling threatened. Threatened by China, threatened by Russia from a military perspective, technologically threatened by China and India, in terms of trade and manufacturing, threatened by China. Difficult. The United States of America, as it is today, particularly with the Trump administration, came to America and to the world by saying, "Make America great again." So that the administration of Trump in this, what is now called Trump 2, is one that wants to be very insular, inward looking. That is how, number one, you cut aid. You say USAID, you are present in different countries offering aid of different kinds, education and health. That money must now come back to the United States. 2, America had stopped manufacturing. All the manufacturing is happening in China, in Vietnam, in Korea, and in different parts of the world. How do we ensure that we revive the manufacturing sector in the United States of America? We use tariffs. So when the presidency of Trump is written as Trump 2, he will possibly be known as the tariff president. So tariff becomes the weapon of choice. Then you also have an America that is grappling with labor, which they say is polluted by illegal migrants. In order to make America great again, you now want to ensure that the immigrants are sent out, and you create a body called ICE. And you therefore are expelling people from Latin America primarily and different parts of the world. You find yourself in that space. And you also hold the view that America has been losing out or hemorrhaging by supporting organizations such as NATO. So you tell NATO, pay your bills. But you are also grappling with another reality, that the dollar, which since 1970s has become the dominant currency and a fiat currency, is under threat from a new economic grouping called BRICS. So all these wars are being fought from the perspective of the Trumpians or Trumpists on the basis that in order to make America great again, America must be in control. And that is, in my view, a contradiction. That you are saying we don't want to spend too much energy caring about the world, but we must care about the world in order for America to be great again. One need only have listened to the speech of Trump at the UN General Assembly, and many are the times that he went off script. Many are the times that he sounded as if he was addressing the joint House of Congress rather than addressing the international community. And that, I think, is what is happening now. One can actually say that you can see an America which is schizophrenic, split personality. With one side of the mouth, America is saying we want to make America great again. We are going to look inward. With the other side of the mouth, you see America saying we cannot be outside of the activities of the world. How they are going to reconcile all these things is something that is up in the air for purposes of analysis and debate. And this is why I think if you look at American diplomacy as we speak now, there is a mix of what one may call economic diplomacy. You see it with how it is relating with the African countries, with the initiatives such as AGOA, and initiatives where America was supporting different activities in health and education. You see it in the manner in which it is using tariffs as a stick, and you also see it in the manner in which America is using what I call gunboat diplomacy with Venezuela, saying you must do what we want, and if you don't, we are going to bomb boats out of the Caribbean Sea. So this is a power, and this, if you look at history very keenly, when powers are declining, then they become very epileptic in the manner in which they undertake certain enterprises. And I think the United States of America during this time is a little bit epileptic in the manner in which it's confronting different issues. How far it will go is a different debate. Look at the people on the opposite sides. Look at the sobriety with which China deals with these issues. Look at the firmness with which Russia deals with the issues. Look at the clarity with which India is dealing with these issues. And the activities are almost subterranean and non-threatening, very little rhetoric, as opposed to the United States of America. And I think we are going to see a lot more of these going forward, particularly when the American consumer is going to begin to bear the brunt of more expensive goods. Only a few days ago, I was looking at the tariffs that were imposed on luxury watches from Switzerland. And you can see that the American discerning buyer is already beginning to bear the brunt. The wine industry in California, the absence of cheap labor in different parts, particularly in the southern part of the United States of America. And I think that that is going to manifest in midterm elections when the people are going to vote to say, we don't particularly like the direction that the United States of America is taking because we are beginning to feel the pinch in our pockets. Not easy to deal with, but let's see what it will give birth to. You know, whenever I've looked at how the United States of America has behaved vis-a-vis countries that it wants to control, it is very interesting. And Venezuela is not the first one. We remember in Grenada with a man called Bishop. We remember Manuel Antonio Noriega in Nicaragua. We remember with Fidel Castro in the catastrophe in the Bay of Pigs in the 1960s. And I think, and Maduro in Venezuela is under no illusions. In fact, on the 15th, or is it the 14th day of October, while addressing the nation, he said that Venezuela knows that there is an attempt to have a regime change, and that in fact the Nobel Prize has been given as one of the tools that is going to be used for regime change. And it should not be lost on us that what they did was to sever diplomatic ties with Norway and recall the ambassador back to Caracas. This tells you that they are aware that attempts are being made, and those attempts are very subtle and possibly designed even to ensure that there is a coup d'etat. As to whether it will happen or not is a different debate, but there is no doubt that the United States of America wants the Maduro administration out sooner rather than later to be replaced with a friendly administration. And we have seen this trend. Salvador Allende in Chile. So, Venezuela is the next target. And they had better be very careful because Trump is determined.